Jordan Hayes had worked hard to earn his place in this neighborhood. But from the moment he moved in, something felt off. Stairs lingered too long. Conversation stopped when he walked by. And then, one day, the HOA president came knocking with an eviction notice. Jordan Hayes, a successful black homeowner, moves into a prestigious neighborhood, only to find himself targeted by the HOA. Margaret, the HOA president, is convinced that he's trespassing and issues an eviction notice. But when the truth is revealed, the tables turn in the most shocking way. Who really belongs here? A gripping story about bias, authority, and justice you won't want to miss. Jordan Hayes, a successful black homeowner, moves into a prestigious neighborhood, only to find himself targeted by the HOA. Margaret, the HOA president, is convinced that he's trespassing and issues an eviction notice. But when the truth is revealed, the tables turn in the most shocking way. Who really belongs here? A gripping story about bias, authority, and justice you won't want to miss. Main content: Jordan Hayes had worked hard to earn his place in this neighborhood. But from the moment he moved in, something felt off. Stairs lingered too long. Conversation stopped when he walked by. And then, one day, the HOA president came knocking with an eviction notice. Jordan Hayes, a successful black homeowner, moves into a prestigious neighborhood only to find himself targeted by the HOA. Margaret, the HOA president, is convinced that he's trespassing and issues an eviction notice. But when the truth is revealed, the tables turn in the most shocking way. Who really belongs here? A gripping story about bias, authority, and justice you won't want to miss. HOA Karen tries to evict black man, unaware he's the owner of her house. When the HOA president tried to evict him, she had no idea she was walking into her own nightmare. Jordan Hayes had always dreamed of owning property in a quiet upscale neighborhood. After years of hard work, he finally made it happen. The house, a stunning 2-story brick home in Brentwood Estates, Tennessee, sat on a neatly trimmed lot with a wrap-around porch and a spacious backyard. It was exactly what he had envisioned: peaceful, elegant, and the perfect place to settle down. But something felt off from the very first day. Moving boxes still lined the driveway when Jordan noticed the eyes peeking from behind curtains, watching from porches, lingering a second too long as neighbors walked there. Dogs, no one approached, no friendly introductions, no welcome to the neighborhood, just silence. At first he brushed it off. Maybe people here just kept to themselves, maybe they'd warm up over time. The first sign that wouldn't happen came the next morning. Jordan had barely finished brewing his coffee when he heard a sharp knock. At the door, he opened it to find a woman in her mid-60s standing on his porch. She was dressed in a neatly pressed beige blouse, pearl earrings, and a pin with the HOA emblem clipped onto her cardigan. Her posture was rigid, her expression neutral, but there was something in her eyes, something Jordan couldn't quite place. "Good morning," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm Margaret Harrison, president of the Brentwood Estates Homeowners Association." Jordan extended a hand, offering a polite smile. "Nice to meet you. I know who you are," she interrupted, glancing past him into the house. "I wanted to go over a few things." She handed him a thick stack of printed documents stapled in the corner. HOA guidelines. Was this really about HOA rules or something deeper? Jordan skimmed the pages, noting the usual rules: lawn maintenance, exterior paint restrictions, approved mailbox design, standard stuff. But then Margaret cleared her throat. "We like to maintain a certain standard here," she said, her gaze settling on the moving truck still parked in the driveway. "I assume you'll have that removed by this evening." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "It'll be gone once I'm done unpacking." Margaret nodded, but it wasn't a satisfied nod, more like she was making a mental note. "Good," she said, "and just so you're aware, the HOA requires that trash bins be placed at the curb no earlier than 6 a.m. on collection day. I noticed yours were out last night." "I didn't put them out," Jordan replied evenly. "The previous owners must have." Margaret pursed her lips. "I see. Well, in the future, please be mindful. We have rules for a reason, and just like that she turned and walked away. Jordan shut the door, exhaling slowly. Maybe she was just particular a lot of HOA presidents where he wasn't going to let one uptight neighbor ruin his fresh start, but the next few days made it clear Margaret wasn't just particular. She was watching a warning notice appeared in his mailbox about an unauthorized vehicle in the driveway, his own car. A second notice came about. Improper lawn maintenance. His grass had grown an inch, maybe two. Then an HOA violation letter arrived about a porch light that was too bright despite being the same fixture the previous owner had used. By the end of the week, Jordan had collected a neat stack of papers from Margaret. He hadn't spoken to her since their first meeting, but it didn't matter. She had made herself known. Still, he kept his cool. Maybe she was this way with everyone. Maybe he just needed to follow the rules, and she'd back off. But that hope faded fast when Jordan took an evening walk and passed by a group of neighbors chatting on a nearby driveway. They grew quiet when they saw him. One woman offered a tight smile, but no one else acknowledged his presence. And there, standing in the middle, was Margaret, arms crossed, whispering something to the others. Jordan didn't need to hear the words to know this wasn't about HOA rules, it was about him. But if Margaret thought she could intimidate him into leaving, she was in for a surprise. The letters kept coming each morning. Jordan found a new notice folded neatly in his mailbox, sealed with the Brentwood Estates HOA stamp at. First, he tossed them in a kitchen drawer, skimming them just enough to confirm what he already knew. Margaret Harrison was determined to make his life miserable, but by the time he received the fifth letter, in just 2 weeks, Jordan had had enough. This time it was about his trash. Ken's bins must be retrieved within 1 hour of collection to preserve neighborhood aesthetics, the letter read. If it were a different homeowner, would this situation have unfolded the same way? Jordan stared at the paper, irritation bubbling under his skin. He had picked up his bins the same way his neighbors had after work, but apparently that wasn't good enough. Curious, he decided to do a little test. The next morning, he woke up early and took a slow walk through the neighborhood, paying close attention to the houses. By 9 a.m., dozens of trash bins were still lined up along the curbs. Some weren't even fully closed, lids propped open with overflowing bags. Not a single violation notice on any of them, just his. Jordan snapped a few pictures and sent an email to the HOA board, politely asking why his bins were an issue while everyone else's were ignored. No response, but 2 days later, Margaret was back on his doorstep. She didn't knock this time, just stood there waiting, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. Jordan opened the door and leaned against the frame. Something I can help you with. Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked over his shoulder, eyes scanning the inside of his home like she was taking inventory. Then she held up a form. This is a formal request for you to submit proof of home ownership, she said. We've had complaints. Malik's stomach tightened. Complaints? Neighbors have expressed concerns. Margaret continued, her voice syrupy but sharp. They've noticed unusual activity, different cars coming and going, furniture deliveries at odd hours. Some are worried you may be renting this property in violation of HOA regulations. Jordan let out a short, humorous laugh. You're kidding. Margaret's face didn't flinch. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. First off, I own this house. Second, I've lived here less than a month. I'm still moving, and that's why there have been deliveries. And as for the cars, those are friends and family visiting. Margaret pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening around her clipboard. Well, we have policies to ensure all homeowners are properly vetted. We'll need to verify your deed. Jordan knew exactly what this was. He didn't ask any other neighbors for proof of home ownership. Just him. Still, he kept his voice level. You can pull the records yourself. It's public information. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, but she quickly recovered, smoothing out her expression. I'd prefer if you submitted it directly. Jordan tilted his head. And if I don't? Margaret's lips curled into something that was supposed to be a smile, but there was no warmth behind it. Then I'll have no choice but to escalate the matter with the HOA board. Jordan exhaled, slowly holding back the words sitting on the tip of his tongue. She wanted him to react. She wanted him to get angry, to raise his voice, to give her an excuse to turn him into the problem, so he just smiled. "I'll think about it," he said then. Closed the door before she could say another word. Who really had the right to be here all along? Margaret didn't like that evening as Jordan sat on his porch sipping a beer. He saw her again standing at the end of his driveway talking to a man in a polo shirt and khakis. She gestured toward Jordan's house, speaking in hushed tones. The man nodded, scribbling something down on a notepad. Jordan didn't have to guess what was happening. Margaret wasn't just trying to intimidate him anymore. She was looking for a way to get rid of him, but if she thought she could push him out, she was about to learn a hard lesson the next morning. Jordan woke up to an email from the HOA. Subject: notice of violation. It was about his porch furniture. According to the email, his outdoor seating arrangement, 2 wicker chairs and a small glass table, did not conform to the aesthetic standards outlined in the HOA guidelines. A vague rule, one that clearly wasn't being enforced on anyone else. Jordan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had walked this neighborhood more than enough times to know that at least a dozen homes had similar setups. Some even had old plastic chairs that looked like they had been sitting out since the early 2000s. And yet somehow his was the problem. He ignored the notice. A day later, another email arrived. Subject: second notice, lawn maintenance violation. Jordan frowned. His lawn was freshly cut, edged, and watered. He had spent the entire afternoon trimming the hedges, making sure everything was spotless, but there was a formal complaint stating that his grass was slightly overgrown, and warning that fines could be issued if the problem wasn't corrected. Jordan knew exactly what was happening. Margaret was trying to drown him in complaints, stacking up minor infractions until she had enough leverage to escalate things, so he decided to play her game that evening. He took a slow walk through the neighborhood, jotting down every single actual violation. He saw overgrown yards, broken shutters, faded house numbers, trash bins still sitting by the curb from the morning before. Then he submitted his own complaints, each one backed with time-stamped photos. It took less than 24 hours for Margaret to show up again. This time she wasn't alone. She stood at the edge of Malik's driveway with another HOA board member, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a clipboard in hand. Malik recognized him from the HOA website. Edward Coleman, vice president. Margaret's expression was tighter than usual, the forced politeness barely masking her irritation. "Mr. Hayes," she greeted, her voice stretched thin, "we received your list of complaints." Jordan crossed his arms, nodding. "Good, then you know I'm not the only one being held to a ridiculous standard." Edward cleared his throat, glancing at Margaret before speaking. "We appreciate your concerns, but the HOA board determines which issues require action. Not every minor infraction warrants a formal notice." Malcolm scoffed. "So mine do, but everyone else's don't." But why was he being singled out? What made him different? Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out a printed form and handed it to him. "This is your final warning before fines are issued. Your porch furniture needs to be replaced, and your lawn must remain at the regulated length at all times." Jordan stared at the paper, then slowly looked up at Margaret. He wasn't stupid. This wasn't about grass or furniture. This was about making him feel like he didn't belong. He took a deep breath, forcing a slow smile. "You know, Margaret, I've read the HOA bylaws from top to bottom. Nowhere does it say a homeowner needs to replace furniture that's in perfect condition." Margaret stiffened. "It's a matter of neighborhood uniformity." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "So you enforce rules that don't exist?" Margaret's jaw twitched. Stephen shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, Jordan saw doubt creeping into the board member's expression. He wasn't fully convinced. Jordan decided to push a little further. "Let me ask you something," he said, keeping his tone. "Even if I was someone else, say one of my neighbors, would we even be having this conversation?" Margaret's nostrils flared. Edward opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. No answer. Jordan nodded, folding the paper in half. "That's what I thought." Margaret inhaled sharply, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "If you refuse to comply, the HOA has the authority to take further action." Jordan met her gaze, unwavering. "Then do what you have to do." Margaret turned on her heel and walked away, her posture stiff with barely contained frustration. Edward lingered for a second, then followed Jordan, watched them go, gripping the violation notice in his hand. He had just called her bluff, but Margaret wasn't the type to back down easily. Jordan expected Margaret to retaliate, he just didn't expect how far she'd take it. The next morning, a thick envelope sat in his mailbox, no HOA logo. This time instead it was from a law firm. Inside was an official complaint filed with the Davidson County Housing Authority, accusing him of being a fraudulent occupant. Margaret had gone from petty fines to trying to have him legally removed from his own home. Jordan stared at the document, his pulse steady, but his hands tightening around the paper. She was really doing this, he read through the complaint. The claims were flimsy allegations that he had failed to provide proof of home ownership, suspicions that he was renting the property under false pretenses, and a statement that multiple neighbors had expressed concerns about his presence. No names, no actual proof, just assumptions dressed up in legal jargon. For a second, Jordan considered ignoring it. The accusations wouldn't hold up, but then he realized this wasn't about getting him evicted, it was about exhausting him. Margaret wanted him buried in legal headaches. She wanted him frustrated, drained, willing to just walk away rather than fight back. But what she didn't know was that she was playing right into his hands. That evening, Jordan made a phone call. "Hey, Daniel," he said when the line picked up. "I need a favor." Daniel Rodriguez had been Jordan's real estate attorney for years, sharp, relentless, and twice as ruthless as Margaret ever hoped to be. By the next morning, Jordan had everything he needed, and he wasn't just going to defend himself, he was about to flip the entire situation on its head. 3 days later, the HOA emergency board meeting was packed. Margaret sat at the head of the long conference table, her expression carefully neutral. The other board members flanked her, some looking uncomfortable, others pretending to be busy with their notes. The room buzzed with whispered conversations, homeowners shifting in their seats, glancing between Jordan and the board. They had all heard the rumors, they were waiting for a showdown. Margaret cleared her throat, lifting a printed document. "We are here to address the ongoing issue regarding Mr. Hayes's residence, given the numerous violations and the concerns raised by our community members. I'd like to speak." Jordan interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Margaret's lips thinned. "You'll have a chance to respond after now," Jordan said, setting down a stack of his own papers. "I'm speaking now." A murmur spread through the room. Margaret stiffened, but she gestured for him to continue. Jordan stood, unfolding the first document. "This," he said, holding up the deed to his house, "is the legal proof that I own my home, filed, recorded, and indisputable." A few heads turned. Some of the board members exchanged glances. Jordan set the deed down and pulled out another paper. "This," he continued, "is the purchase agreement for another property, 2 and 14 Oakwood Drive." Margaret's face barely changed, but Jordan saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes. Then he pulled out the final document. "And this," he said, letting the words hang in the air, "is the deed for 2 and 16 Oakwood Drive." Margaret's house. The silence that followed was deafening. Jordan didn't sit back down. He let the weight of the moment settle. Let Margaret process what just happened. The same woman who had spent weeks trying to have him removed had just found out that her own house belonged to him, and she hadn't even known. Margaret's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Then in a quiet, tight voice, she asked how Jordan folded his arms. "You might want to check the HOA records, Margaret. That foreclosure you ignored, the property sale that went through last month. I was the buyer." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret's hands clenched around the papers in front of her. Jordan tilted his head. "So tell me, Margaret, who's the real trespasser now?" And just like that, the entire room shifted. The room sat in stunned silence. Margaret's face had drained of color, her perfectly controlled demeanor cracking at the edges. The power she had wielded over Jordan for weeks had just disintegrated in front of everyone. Jordan took his time, letting the weight of his words settle. He wasn't done. He picked up another document from his neatly stacked pile. "Now let's talk about fraudulent eviction attempts." Margaret's head snapped up. "Excuse me." Jordan tapped the legal complaint she had filed. You reported me as an illegal occupant. You claimed I had no right to live in my home. He paused, then looked directly at her. Would you care to explain why? Margaret's fingers twitched against the table, but she forced her voice to remain even. As I stated in my report, several residents expressed concerns who. Jordan interrupted. Margaret's jaw tightened. I am not at liberty to disclose no names, Jordan said, raising an eyebrow. That's funny because I spoke to several neighbors before this meeting. No one remembers expressing concerns. A few murmurs stirred in the crowd. Homeowners exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably. The tension in the room shifted. It wasn't just between Jordan and Margaret anymore. People were starting to see it. Margaret opened her mouth, but Jordan continued before she could recover. You accused me of violating HOA policies, yet you've repeatedly ignored other violations in this community. He pulled out a stack of printed emails. I filed formal complaints about broken shutters, overgrown lawns, trash bins left out for days. None of them resulted in violation notices. He turned to the rest of the board. Tell me, do these rules only apply when Margaret feels like enforcing them? Edward Coleman, the HOA vice president, cleared his throat. I think we should take a moment to know, Jordan said sharply, eyes still on Margaret, because this isn't about HOA rules. It never was. This was about her deciding who she thinks belongs here. Sharp murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret's lips parted, panic flashing across her face. For the first time, Jordan wasn't just exposing her. He was forcing the entire neighborhood to see what had been happening right in front of them. Margaret let out a shaky breath. Mr. Hayes, I was simply trying to intimidate me into leaving. Jordan finished for her. Yeah, I got that. Silence, then a voice from the back of the room broke through. This is a disgrace, an older man muttered. Malik turned to see Mr. Holloway, one of the longest-standing residents of the neighborhood. He shook his head, looking at Margaret. You really tried to evict the man who owns your house. A few scattered chuckles echoed through the room. The shift was happening, but Jordan wasn't done yet. He placed his final document on the table. And one more thing, Margaret, you're behind on your HOA fees. Her head snapped up. That's a lie. Jordan tapped the paper. I bought your house at auction. Remember, that includes the debt attached to it. You owe the HOA over $3,000 in unpaid fines and fees. A fresh wave of whispers spread through the board members. Edward adjusted his glasses, frowning as he read over the document. Margaret, is this true? Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. She had buried herself. Jordan leaned back in his chair. I suggest you start paying up. Wouldn't want to violate any of your own rules, would you? A low chuckle swept through the crowd. Even some of the board members were barely containing their reactions. Margaret's face burned red. She had spent weeks trying to control Jordan, and now in front of the entire HOA, her authority had been reduced to nothing. She clenched her jaw, scrambling for a way out. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped, shoving her papers into a folder. We will revisit this matter at a later date. She shot to her feet and marched toward the exit, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, but for the first time, no one followed her. Jordan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. He had one, but Margaret wasn't the type to walk away without a fight. Margaret stormed out of the HOA meeting, her face tight with barely contained rage. The silence she left behind was thick. No one moved, no one spoke. The board members shifted uncomfortably, as if finally realizing they had hitched themselves to the wrong wagon. Jordan didn't move either. He just sat back watching. Then slowly the murmurs began. Can you believe this? Someone whispered. She tried to evict the wrong guy. Another chuckled. Edward Coleman, still seated at the table, cleared his throat. Well, he started, awkwardly adjusting his tie. I think it's safe to say this situation was mishandled. Mishandled? Jordan let out a short laugh. That was one way to put it. One of the neighbors, Samantha Hendricks, a middle-aged woman who lived 3 houses down, turned to him. I don't know what to say, she admitted. I had no idea she was doing all this. Jordan arched an eyebrow. Didn't you? Samantha opened her mouth, but no words came out. A few others looked away, shifting in their seats, because the truth was they did know. They had watched as Margaret issued violation after violation. They had seen how she singled Jordan out, and yet until she embarrassed herself, no one had said a word. The guilt was settling in now, but guilt wasn't an apology, and Jordan wasn't interested in empty words. Instead, he turned to Stephen. Since we're still here, let's discuss actual HOA violations. Stephen straightened uneasy. Like what? Jordan picked up his list. The same one Margaret had ignored when he submitted it weeks ago. Broken fences, trash bins, left out for days, lawns that haven't been mowed in weeks. All of these violations exist right now, but somehow I was the only one receiving fines. Edward glanced at the list, then at the other board members. A few of them looked visibly uncomfortable. They knew Jordan was right. We'll review these complaints properly, Edward said. Jordan gave a slow nod. Good, and while you're at it, I'd like to file a formal complaint against Margaret Harrison for harassment, falsifying HOA complaints, and attempting to misuse her authority for personal grievances. A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Samantha shifted in her seat. Do we have the authority to do that? Edward let out a slow breath. The board can vote for removal if an HOA officer is found abusing their position. Jordan leaned forward, then put it to a vote. Samantha hesitated, then nodded. Seconded. One by one, hands started going up around the room. Jordan watched as the people who had once stood by silently now voted to strip Margaret of her title. It was ironic. If she had just left him alone, she'd still be HOA president, but her own arrogance had been her downfall. A few minutes later, Edward cleared his throat. By a majority vote, Margaret Harrison is officially removed as president of the Brentwood Estates HOA, effective immediately. There was the final nail in the coffin. Jordan stood, slipping his papers into his folder. Well, he said, turning toward the door that was productive. A few chuckles broke the tension, and as he stepped out, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. They had all learned a lesson that night, but the person who needed it most was still in denial because Margaret Harrison wasn't done yet. Margaret Harrison didn't take defeat lightly. The morning after her public humiliation at the HOA meeting, Jordan spotted her standing at the edge of his driveway. She wasn't alone. This time her husband Nathan, a man in his early 70s with a stiff posture and a scowl, stood beside her. Jordan stepped onto his porch, arms crossed. Something I can help you with? Margaret's voice was tight, controlled. I want to discuss the sale of my home. Jordan had expected this. After all, the thought of renting from him must have been unbearable for her. I'm not selling, he said simply. Margaret's jaw clenched. I've lived in that house for 32 years. Jordan tilted his head. And yet you never paid off the debt attached to it. Nathan cleared his throat. We're prepared to offer you a fair price. Jordan leaned against the railing. Define fair. Margaret huffed, her patience wearing thin. The same amount you paid at auction. Jordan let out a short laugh. That's not how real estate works. You lost your house because of unpaid fees. I legally purchased it. If you want it back, you'll have to buy it at market value. Margaret's hands balled into fists. That's ridiculous. You're just trying to make a profit off of me. Malik's expression hardened. No, Margaret. I'm treating you exactly how you treated me. Silence stretched between them for weeks. She had weaponized rules and regulations against him, convinced she held all the power. Now she was the one at someone else's mercy. Nathan sighed. How much? Jordan glanced toward the house. Given the location, the current market, and your unpaid fees, $450,000. Margaret's face twisted. That's outrageous. Jordan shrugged. Then I guess you'll have to find somewhere else to live. For the first time, true panic flickered across her face. This was real now. She wasn't just being removed from the HOA board. She was losing the home she had lived in for 3 decades. Nathan sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. We'll consider it. Jordan nodded. Take your time. As they turned to leave, Margaret hesitated. She looked back at him, something different in her expression. Not quite remorse, but the realization that she had never actually been in control. For weeks, she had been so focused on pushing him out that she hadn't seen the real danger. Her own actions had cost her everything. Jordan let the moment sit before speaking. Margaret, she turned stiffly. Next time you judge someone before knowing them. He gestured toward her house. Remember where it got you. She didn't say a word, just turned and walked away. A month later, the for sale sign went up in front of 216 Oakwood Drive. Margaret had refused to buy back the house at Jordan's price, and no bank would give her a loan for the amount she needed. She and Nathan packed up and left in the middle of the night, moving to a smaller place across town. The neighborhood changed after that, without Margaret in charge. The HOA actually started working the way it was supposed to, addressing real issues instead of policing nonsense, and the neighbors, some still avoided eye contact, embarrassed by their silence, but others made an effort, slowly breaking the wall they had helped Margaret build. One day, Samantha Hendricks, one of the few who had voted against Margaret, walked up Jordan's driveway with a plate of cookies. "I know it's late," she said, shifting awkwardly, "but welcome to the neighborhood." Jordan smiled, accepting the plate. "Took you long enough," Samantha chuckled a little sheepish. "Yeah, it did." Jordan took a bite of a cookie, sweet, little stale, but better late than never. Some people spend their lives trying to control others. They think their power comes from rules, from status, from making others feel small, but real power that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone take that away from you. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more, because trust me, there's plenty more where this came from. So, who really had the right to be here? And what does this reveal about the way we perceive ownership and belonging? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. So, who really had the right to be here? And what does this reveal about the way we perceive ownership and belonging? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes justice isn't about who holds the most power, it's about who holds the truth.